Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. 10 years ago, a psychedelic community conference emerged, the Women's Visionary Congress, really adding another really key thread to what was then still a rather underground discussion. And as I've talked about before, conferences and congresses and gatherings really played a key role in developing, laying the foundation for today's psychedelic renaissance, not necessarily so much in terms of the strict science involved, that other sorts of organizations and characters were laying the groundwork for that emergence, but really in terms of creating a space, a larger, more multidimensional space for people to understand, integrate, revise, enjoy each other's company, but also really firm up the sense that there was a community or a set of interlocking communities. And the Women's Visionary Congress was not only an important site for this general discussion, but also put, as you might gather from the name of the Congress, the issue of gender front and center, which itself has been an interesting and not altogether happy affair in the history of psychedelic discourse, which probably even more than most discourses has tended to be dominated by white men. And without being, excessively controversial or chaotic in their attempt to create another zone, the Women's Visionary Congress really created a kind of alternative dimension. They're reminding us that women have been part of this conversation, both in the West and in indigenous contexts, for much longer periods of time, and indeed continues to go forward with full steam ahead. In a week and a half, the weekend of the 12th through 13th, there's going to be a set of events in New York City. Women's Visionary Congress has generally been a West Coast affair. But they're heading east for some events, and you can find out more about that on Reality Sandwich. There's a recent posting, and we'll talk more about that today because we're talking with one of the a member of the board of directors and one of the co-founders of the Women's Visionary Congress, Annie Harrison, a.k.a. Annie Oak. And so we'll be talking to her about that and related topics and the issues as psychedelic culture and consciousness continues its rather dramatic transformation in today's bizarre world. So, Annie, thanks for joining us on Expanding Mind.
You're very welcome. I'm happy to be here.
That's great. Well, tell me a little bit about the founding of the Congress. What was the conversation? What was the goal? What was the kind of environment that you were in when this seemed to be something that needed to happen?
Well, at that time I was working as a journalist and also working with a group of human rights researchers. And I was very interested in the drug war as our own human rights struggle here in the United States. As a science writer and a reporter, I had been covering conferences and events where participants were talking about drug policy and the then emerging therapies using substances like MDMA to treat PTSD, using psilocybin to treat end-of-life anxiety, and the investigations into medical cannabis to treat a number of ailments. And I noticed while covering these events that very few women were speaking. And I was surprised by that because I knew a lot of women who were involved in this field. And I have this theory in life that if you want to change the world, throw a better party. So I decided to start a nonprofit organization called the Women's Visionary Congress, or the WVC, to organize gatherings where women and men, people of all genders, could talk about non-ordinary states of consciousness. And this began 10 years ago. We invited researchers, healers, artists, activists, spiritual leaders, women who work with plants to join us and gather and present their work. And I was fortunate enough to be working with a group of women who gathered together to put on these events, and we've been doing it ever since. We'll celebrate our 10th anniversary this year.
And I'm curious, did you have discussions ever about whether at least some of the events should be women only? Was that ever part of the vision, or was it more about making room for women to come together both to organize and to appear and give presentations, and not worry so much about drawing those really distinct boundaries as a way to balance what can be a very male kind of dominated discourse?
Well, we wanted to preference the voices of women. We saw that they were underrepresented at conferences and other gatherings, scholarly talks, etc. But we also wanted to create a safe space for women to speak. Women have lots of other pressures to not talk about these issues that men typically don't face. Women make, for example, a lot less money than men. So if they're worried about being harassed by the police or prosecutors, legal authorities for exercising their constitutional right to speak out, they have less money to hire lawyers and defend themselves. They're also more vulnerable to having their children taken away, being accused of being unfit mothers, unfit parents, and perhaps in some cases also having their professional licenses taken away as doctors or nurses or healers or therapists, etc. So we wanted to create a space that felt safe. We raised money for a bail fund. We raised money to hire lawyers to be on call to defend anybody who was harassed for speaking out and talking about their work. And what we discovered by doing this is that women felt more comfortable coming and talking, often sharing very personal stories in this environment. I'm very happy to say that in the 10 years we've been holding these gatherings, our main gathering is up north of San Francisco every June, and we hold salons around the US and in Canada as well. In 10 years of doing this, nobody, to our knowledge, who's ever spoken at the WVC has ever been harassed for anything they said. But we felt we had to take a really firm stance to defend our right to speak and to gather. And as to the question of only including women, well, we did discuss that. I think there is benefit to gatherings that include just women or just men. But it was our transgendered friends who came to us and said, well, asked the obvious question, what is a woman? Do I have to be born a woman to be part of your group? What if I was born a man and I've transitioned to being a woman? And we realized that really the divine feminine lives within all of us. It's much more of a connection to the earth and to the spirit world than our genders. And ever since then, we've always been open to people of all genders at our events. And I hope we always will.
Yeah. One of the things I really like about your work in particular and how you approach these things is that you have a connection with the divine feminine, with the sort of indigenous models or indigenous inspired models of deeper relationships between women and the earth, or women and nurturing, and sort of some of the more traditional kinds of images that surround women, which can be problematic in some cases, but can be very helpful and healing and illuminating in other contexts, and certainly help balance out, again, situations that are overly dominated by male voices and male themes. But you've also always had a really, a hard investigative journalist, human rights, legal edge. Like, you've really been bringing a certain kind of in your face, knowing the rules, knowing legal rights, and being very aware and savvy about the more hard-edged dimensions of, contemporary existence. And I'd love to hear a little bit about you talking a little bit about why these conversations and these experiences are not just important for us psychologically, but that they're matters of human rights, with that whole sort of the weight of that kind of language, of that kind of politics behind them.
Well, my own background, I come out of the downtown New York scene in the late 1970s. I got to see the punk scene explode and the whole Studio 54 scene unfold, the beginning of the AIDS crisis in New York in the late 1970s. It was a very interesting political time to come of age, and I learned a lot from the artists and the activists who were part of that scene. Earlier, when I was in high school, I was inspired by the Watergate scandal and the press coverage. Played a large role in Nixon's resignation in August of '74. I was a teenager, and I saw that reporters, in this case Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein, the Washington Post, could really uncover abuses of power and implicate the U.S. Justice Department, the FBI, the CIA, the White House. And I decided that I wanted to be a journalist because of the role of political watchdogs that role that journalists play. It seemed like a useful way to spend one's professional career. So I ended up getting a degree in political science. I became a video and radio documentary film producer. I went off and got a graduate degree in science reporting from the Columbia University School of Journalism, and really tried to chart my own course. I was very interested as a young journalist in this strange topic called internet news delivery. The internet was then a relatively largely unknown phenomenon, mostly used by scientists. The web had not been invented yet. I was interested in how reporters used internet bulletin boards that were early online discussion sites where people could hold conversations and post messages. And I was interested in how reporters used this online service to file politically controversial news stories when the country they were reporting in closed down or censored their wire service. So I was always very interested in the intersection between human rights, journalism, and art. And in my own work, I think all of those things have really pushed me towards the work that I've done. In the 1990s, I got work as a tech reporter, and I wrote a lot about the then emerging free software movement, privacy and security issues. I found this weird thing on the internet called Burning Man and convinced my editors at CNN and Business Week to send me to Burning Man in 1996 to cover cool technology like lasers. There was no internet access on the playa then, so I had to sometimes go into Reno to file my stories, and I did a deal with a satellite internet company. I wrote about them, and they brought a dish to the playa, and I got to get online at Burning Man and write about that. The the Burning Man org thought that the internet was going to pollute the art there, but I thought that it was a useful addition. Of course, now they run their own network, Trench Fiber. But I became very interested in how social movements, communities were using technology to really speak truth to power and to hold powerful people accountable. In 1999, I was sent by my editors to San Francisco to cover the first dot-com boom. And I wrote stories for Wired News and Agence France Presse, the Newswire. And I covered the first round of debates about the strong use of encryption, what has continued to be efforts by the US government to build backdoors into technology products. I wrote about computer hacking and the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which defends civil rights in cyberspace. And I started to cover local drug war stories for the Bay Guardian, the weekly newspaper here in San Francisco then. And I covered the underground marijuana industry, stories involving federal and state prosecution of people who used, grew, and sold cannabis. And that was really an eye-opening experience for me. The drug war is, of course, a huge human rights issue, both in the US and countries around the world. It's an issue that sends many people of color to prison. It's a racist war. We all know that. And I was very interested in how journalism and art and the evolving of social consciousness could really help to address the abuses that took place as a result of the drug war. And it's still a topic that I'm very deeply engaged with.
Yeah, I think I first became familiar with your work reading your cannabis coverage and really enjoying it. I mean, I had my own alternative weekly background as a big writer for the Village Voice for many years. Even though I didn't do investigative stuff too much, I was more of a cultural journalist. But I remember your pieces quite well, and in some ways, I wish you were still being an investigative reporter. I know you moved on at some point, and I'm actually kind of curious a little bit, since issues around journalism are obviously still really important, but there's some good arguments to be made that some of the features of the internet have made it more difficult for certain kinds of investigative reporting to happen and to be noised abroad, even if in other ways very powerful new forms of media are emerging. And I'm kind of curious. I'm sure you had multiple reasons to step away from doing the kind of investigative work that you were doing, and we can talk about what you moved on to in a moment. But I'm interested in whether that was partly a decision to move away from journalism because of where you saw it was going, and in any case, how you see what the situation now in contrast to, let's say, the 90s or even the early 2000s, in terms of the kinds of places and voices and resources that were available for people to look at this kind of nexus of human rights, drug law, state power, etc.
Well, by the late 1990s, I was doing a lot of business reporting, and I could see that the business model for newspapers, large media companies, and especially investigative journalism was about to collapse. And of course it did. And it was very interesting to be trained for a role, for a job in an industry that you were watching the dissolution of. And I realized, because I was covering a lot of cultural evolution that was taking place online on the internet, that most content was going to be free, and that I was perhaps one of the last generations of well-paid technology and science reporters. And I knew that that was probably going to go away, and it has. There are still really good reporters out there doing great investigative work, but it's expensive to support teams of reporters like that. The recent movie Spotlight looks at this. group of investigative reporters at the Boston Globe. So I realized that it was going to be a different world for reporters. And also in 2006, my life as a reporter changed really drastically. I went down to Guatemala to cover a story for Wired News about an organization called the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, which analyzed patterns of state-sponsored violence around the world and developed scientifically defensible findings for prosecutors and truth and reconciliation commissions. And I had written about their analysis of state-sponsored violence in East Timor, and the founder of the group, Patrick Ball, invited me to join him to examine a very large archive of police documents that had just been discovered in Guatemala City. And I had one of those moments that many journalists have in their careers. I knew that my editors were not going to pay for me to go to Guatemala, but I really wanted to cover this story. So I reached into my own savings, and in just a few days' notice, I went with Patrick Ball to Guatemala City. And we entered this crumbling building inside a compound of the civil police force. It was a barbed wire ringed compound full of barking police dogs and crushed cars. And inside this building, we found stacks of crumbling police records, photographs, floppy disks, identity cards, and entire file cabinets full of police records going back a century. Now, at the time, and still now, Guatemala was emerging from 36 years of armed internal conflict, and tens of thousands of people had died, mostly at the hands of state forces. And so these records, which were an estimated 80 million documents, had been collected by the Guatemalan National Police, which had been disbanded after the UN brokered peace accords in 1996. The police had always denied that records of their involvement in these mass human rights violations existed, but there they were. And the government of Guatemala gave Patrick Ball 24 hours to come up with a plan for how to analyze the contents of this archive. And a lot of people were concerned that it would be burned down by people complicit in these crimes, really none of whom had ever been brought to justice. So Patrick turned to me and said, well, we need your help to write this proposal for how to analyze this data. And I said, I'm a journalist. I can't do that. If I help you, I'll never be able to cover the story as a reporter because it would be a conflict of interest. And at this point, I'd been a journalist for 20 years. And Patrick said to me, well, this is probably the largest collection of human rights documents ever discovered in the Americas. And analyzing this data could give us clues as to what happened to many thousands of people who were killed or disappeared in the conflict. And if we could figure out how to analyze these records, that information might be used to bring the perpetrators of these crimes to justice and really help end this long history of impunity in Guatemala. So that was really a moment of reckoning for me as a journalist. In the end, I decided to step aside from my role as a reporter, and I helped Patrick and his team of data analysts write a proposal for developing a multi-stage scientific random sample of this huge archive of records. It became known as the Historic Archive of the Guatemalan National Police. The proposal was accepted. The work began in 2006. A few months later, I stopped working for Wired and went to work as the communications director for a nonprofit Silicon Valley group called Benetech, which was the umbrella organization for the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. And I worked in Silicon Valley with them for 8 years until 2013, when the Human Rights Data Analysis Group spun off and became its own separate organization. And I went with that group and became their senior science writer, documenting the work of these data analysts. And in the meantime, the data in that archive was used to convict former officers and commanders of the Guatemalan National Police, who were sent to prison for disappearing and presumably killing people whom the government perceived to be political opponents. And I'm now writing a book about the work of the Human Rights Data Analysis Group in Guatemala, El Salvador, Kosovo, Colombia, East Timor, Liberia, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Syria, where the Human Rights Data Analysis Group is now analyzing patterns of state-sponsored violence, so that when there is a political opening in the Syrian conflict, that data can be used by prosecutors. So that's my journey. Yeah. I still do journalism, and yet I've really become immersed in human rights research and writing about how scientists can help to end political polarization, generate defensible data, and bring perpetrators to justice to help end impunity.
Yeah, well, one of the remarkable things about the data analysis, which I didn't know about until I, talked to you about it many years ago, is it's almost a kind of temporality, a kind of way of relating to time and history, because it's not like you hear about a case, in the world court or wherever, a tribunal, and then the data needs to be developed for that particular case. It's that you are creating archives and as scientifically rigorous data as possible in the hope and anticipation that in the future there will be a political opening, a legal opening to make this data, to activate it, to operationalize it. So it has this strange and I'm sure sometimes difficult and sometimes very hopeful kind of character to it, because it's like you're going, well, we know that we can use data science now to make the most rigorous kinds of information possible in these horrible situations, in the hope that it emerges at some point, so that when that moment arises, the data's there, it's ready to go, it's ready to be activated upon. It's a very interesting kind of temporality or kind of way of doing work in light of the future. Does that make sense? I'm kind of curious how that, if that sort of has adds a character or quality to the kind of work that you guys do.
Yes, it often takes many, many years for data analysts to collect different data sources, compare different data sources, as the Human Rights Data Analysis Group does, look for overlaps in those data sources, incidents that are covered by more than one source of data, and in those overlaps, determine how many people were killed or disappeared in a given conflict that were never counted, and then add that to the overall total of the deaths and disappearances. And that type of statistical analysis is a much more accurate way to estimate patterns of state-sponsored violence and much more robust in court as evidence. And that takes many years to do. And sometimes that evidence isn't brought forward for years until a case can be made against a perpetrator or group of perpetrators. It's the opposite of journalism, which goes on the 24-hour news cycle, in which you're always up against deadline, in which you perceive that you're writing the first draft of history, but actually most journalists are only working with very limited data sources. And because you're only working with a tiny handful of data sources as opposed to comparing entire sets of data about killings or disappearances, you inject much more bias into your reporting, into your stories. As a journalist, I've found it very satisfying to take the long view of history and to be able to work with a group of scientists whose findings are much more accurate and less biased than the vast majority of reports filed by journalists about state-sponsored violence, about patterns of violence in a conflict. It's very satisfying, but it's a completely different mindset. And it's been an interesting transition.
I can't help but ask, I mean, dealing with this kind of, with these atrocities and the degree of atrocity across the world, and it's just, it's overwhelming. It's emotionally overwhelming, and yet the approach of the data analysis group, of course, is to approach these things with the most dry, statistical, abstract, mathematical approaches, because those in the long run are the most effective. And I can only imagine that it creates a very interesting sort of psychological field where, it's not that you're responding to atrocities by hitting the ground with, services that are going to support refugees and dealing with individuals who are in your face, who have ongoing issues. You're mostly dealing with the record of past crimes with people who are gone. And doing it with this sort of approach, the statistical approach that in itself is very abstract. It's sort of, in a way, pulled away from the human context as a sort of intellectual operation. So it's got to be a very weird emotional space that you guys go through, and the kinds of relations you must have with other people in the group, and the data analysts and the people who are on the ground must really be quite remarkable.
Well, I want to emphasize that the people who live in these countries that are undergoing this type of conflict, mass state-sponsored violence, the people who live there, who gather the data about killings and disappearances and human rights violations, they're the people who risk their lives to collect that information. And that information is collected by hospitals, by prisons, by morgues, by NGOs, by all sorts of groups. And that information is then collected by the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, and different data sets are compared. But the analysts never forget that the information they're dealing with is information that describes people who have suffered and been violated and have died, often in conflict. And one of the best ways to honor what has occurred to these people and to their families is to make sure that their deaths and the violations against them are counted and acknowledged. And one of the only ways to end this type of impunity is to have defensible evidence against the perpetrators so that you can prosecute them and send them to prison. And then maybe the next perpetrator, the next state-sponsored general, warlord, paramilitary organization will think twice about killing an entire village, about hauling people out of their houses in the middle of the night and disappearing them. It is one of the only ways to directly address impunity. And that's why I find it so satisfying to work with this group. It's because you can write news stories until the cows come home about all the atrocities that are going on, conflicts around the world. But one piece of journalism doesn't necessarily hold up in court. It's a subjective document. Any good defense attorney can say, that's just based on a couple of sources. You're only focusing on the most egregious violation. It doesn't reflect the whole scope of the violence. It's not defensible evidence. And if you really want to help end impunity, you need defensible evidence. So it's very satisfying in that way. And we try never to lose track of the fact that we're writing about people who have suffered and died. And we keep that in our minds as we do this work.
I mean, I know it's a huge question, but I would just love if you could, just to illuminate me and listeners, it seems like one of the weak links in this vision, or one of the places of great difficulty, are the judicial apparatuses that would use this information, that the context, because you're dealing with state actors, because the sort of world governance and world courts are such a strange and tentative kind of structure. Where do you see development happening, positive signs or negative signs in terms of creating those judicial structures that are necessary to act on the kind of information that you guys are putting together?
Well, it's different for each conflict. In Guatemala, the UN stepped in and negotiated a peace settlement between a coalition of guerrilla groups and the government in 1996. There was a series of successive governments, and a judiciary arose, an independent judiciary in Guatemala that began to use this data to prosecute former police commanders. There was just a group of former Guatemalan army commanders indicted in Guatemala using some of this data, and those commanders will be put on trial. So that's an example of a country where a succeeding government or a series of successive governments have created social institutions, independent judiciary that can look at the past and begin to try people for crimes that were committed during these conflicts. In other places like Kosovo, the International Criminal Court stepped in. The Human Rights Data Analysis Group had collected evidence against Slobodan Milosevic that was going to be used to try him in the International Criminal Court for war crimes. Of course, he died in custody before that could happen. But in each different conflict, there are different systems of justice. In Liberia, the judicial system was destroyed along with many social institutions, and so they had truth and reconciliation hearings around the country where people stood up and just described what happened to them. And that was a form of national healing. So it really depends on the conflict and on what type of judicial process exists. People need to take the long view and be patient often for those openings to occur. The other thing I will say is that because I'm immersed in this work now, I find myself being drawn to how artists interpret the world. And I find myself doing more art to make sense of this information for myself and to express how I feel about it. And that's been an interesting development.
Yeah, is that related to, I was going to ask you how, listeners will have noticed we've sort of covered two very different, in some ways, courses of your interests and your activity, although they're connected by a deep concern with human rights. There's clearly, a wide variation between the good parties associated with the Women's Visionary Congress and the kinds of atrocities that you have to look with straight in the face more than most of us can handle. And I'm curious how you manage that. How do those two things, two aspects of your work support each other? And maybe talking about art is one of the ways to talk about that.
Well, the Women's Visionary Congress has waded directly into human rights discussions. We have received a lot of messages from women who have been the targets of sexual harassment and assault by people who lead ceremonies in which psychoactive substances are used. We acknowledge that many people find these ceremonies beneficial to their healing and personal growth, and they've been beneficial to our healing and personal growth. But we have responded to these reports by developing a series of safety suggestions for women and men who participate in these ceremonies. And you can find these suggestions under the resources link on the WVC website, visionarycongress.org. And I have also written about them on the Reality Sandwich site as well. So we look at really both the benefits and challenges of non-ordinary states of consciousness. In terms of art, as I found myself immersed in research about state-sponsored violence and writing about atrocities all day long and thinking about the drug war, I found that I wanted to create art that helped to nourish and sustain people in difficult times. I'm really interested in the idea of resiliency, and I felt especially drawn to create what I call collaborative, community-based art. I started my first large art project in 2011 when I created the Full Circle Tea House at Burning Man. There were a lot of bars at that event, but I wanted to create a place where people could go rest and hydrate and have quiet conversations outside the noise and music and alcohol zone. So we started a tea bar, and we serve excellent pu'ers, aged Chinese black teas. We blend our own herbal teas. The tea house now has a large community of volunteers that keep it going. And for the past 5 years, we've brought the Full Circle Tea House to lots of festivals and parties on the West Coast and supported other sister tea houses in other parts of the world. We're going to do a crowdfunding campaign for the tea house later this summer. So please help support that project or hire us to appear at your gathering. It's a really great art project that is now run by many people. It's a collaborative effort. I also co-founded a Burning Man theme camp called Camp Soft Landing, where the tea house has been based. And I just created a succession plan to hand that camp off after 5 years to another generation of burners. I documented this process in a story I wrote for the Burning Man Journal. You can go and see what kind of insights we had from running a theme camp for a couple of years. That was a lot of fun. And about 3 years ago, I started to produce large immersive art events. I founded, together with two partners, an event production company called Take Three Presents to create art and theater experiences that shift people's social conditioning. And we work with a community of artists to create forms of immersive design. It's a form of storytelling, in which we create an event that includes a narrative and a meta-narrative about the participants' experience. It's a way to confront political issues and spark positive change and be playful and empathetic, but guided by a goal of cultural evolution. So our events create this sensory world that pursues an objective and reaches for some resolution within a narrative arc and a collaborative interaction. And we use a lot of humor and absurdist theater to encourage participants to contribute to our shared storyline and create a transformative experience and calls to action. We don't do social media and we don't serve alcohol. And it's been a very interesting experience and satisfying artistic one.
Yeah, and are you going to bring a little slice of that immersive theater to New York in a week and a half?
I am. I've created an immersive art piece that will take place in Central Park at the statue of Alice in Wonderland. And it's going to take place at that statue starting at around 10 o'clock and going to about 2 in the afternoon. We're going to have a tea party, and we're going to do an immersive art piece called Alice Has Options. As you recall, Alice had some interesting experiences in Wonderland. She fell down the rabbit hole, and she ate a mushroom and a currant cake and drank from a bottle that said, "Drink me." And these experiences made her large and made her small. She was trying to reach her secret garden, this beautiful garden that she was seeking and couldn't quite fit through the door. So the secret garden is kind of a metaphor for our place of beauty and happiness. So in this art piece, we're going to embody different types of altered states of consciousness, and each player is going to make a pitch for their own altered state and try to convince the participants to come sit next to them and tell stories about that particular altered state. And we, acknowledge the WVC that altered states are not just pharmacological states. The word psychedelic, of course, as you know, derives from the Greek word psyche or mind, and delusion, or the word that means to make visible, to reveal. So we acknowledge that non-ordinary consciousness can be reached through many means, including meditation, dreams, prayer, sex, physical disciplines, near-death events, spiritual practices, encounters with the natural world, dance, music, etc. So the players in this experience are going to portray different states of consciousness and try to convince you that they're the best and to come over to their side. I think it should be fun, and it's free, and we welcome everyone to join us.
Yeah, it sounds like a blast. Another question about these events that you've been doing more recently, again, something that I've noticed both of the Tea House and the Take 3 events, is that you've done a really wonderful job of becoming involved with younger people, with people in their 20s, what I was saying, the next generation of burners and people who are artists, psychedelic activists, event promoters. Was that something that was just natural for you, or did you kind of, in some sense, intend to move forward with creating structures that would draw in a lot of younger people?
Well, I think that for the type of art that I do, part of creating that piece of art includes a plan to pass it along. I want to create art that's sustainable, that inspires successive generations. I serve on the WVC board, but we now have a new young executive director of the WVC, Antara Zostek, who is carrying forward together with a new generation of women that project. And my Take 3 partners are both young men. And also my partners and co-collaborators in the Tea House tend to be in their 20s and 30s. I'll be 55 this year, and I really believe that one needs to have friends of all ages, that one should be immersed in the cultures of all generations to really be effective as an artist, to collaborate, to pass on things that you create. It's essential to the work that I do. And I get a lot of joy out of it. And I work with a lot of amazing people who continue to inspire me. I will say that it is challenging to be an older woman in this culture. There is a lot of ageism, especially in the tech and media industries, and that compounded with sexism and a focus on youth means that a lot of older women are largely treated like they're invisible unless you're in a caretaking role where you're perceived as a mother figure. But if you step outside that role, it's sometimes difficult to get your voice heard and to be taken seriously. And I still see a lot of opportunities going to the young men. And I really want, within my lifetime and in my next 55 years, to really see this continue to evolve and not feel like I do sometimes that I'm looking at old wine in new bottles, that the opportunities for older women and older men as well, older people of all genders, continues to expand, that older people are respected for what they bring to the culture, and that they play an essential role in our potential for spiritual renewal and innovation and cultural resilience. We make a point at Take 3 events to include people of all generations, and the art that I'm working on now certainly does that. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what my boomer generation does in the next 50 years of their lives as older people and how they impact the culture.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, particularly thinking about it in terms of if you want to call it psychedelic culture or visionary culture, as something that emerges or explodes in the 60s and 70s and then goes through its various transformations over the last decades, where on the one hand, more than a lot of social spaces, my experience of that community has been one in which there are always young people, and that there are older people who are seen as elders or wisdom figures or hilarious old coots who tell great stories, and that there has been more of an exchange across generations in that world than in any of the other worlds that I've been in, other than academia, where it's formalized in terms of teachers and students. And that's very positive. On the other hand, I think that not being, in a way like the tribal, a tribal culture or an indigenous culture is sort of a model, but of course we can't really do that as moderns. We're not tribal, we're not indigenous, and some problems with that is that there are not very very established forms for intergenerational communication. Again, outside of like a traditional university situation, and so it's hard to figure out where those kinds of things happen. And it seems to me that part of what you've done with the Women's Visionary Congress and with your other sort of large-scale social sculptures is come up with ways that might help make that transition. And I say that very personally too, because in a way, I mean, I'm a teacher type. I communicate. I've always been fascinated by cultures, by young, youthful cultures. But I sometimes go, wow, I don't know. I'm not exactly sure how I am going to show up for younger people, what they're interested in, where to arise in the sort of culture, because there aren't that many places where it's sort of clear that there's room for older people who have wisdom or at least hilarious stories, and young people who are interested in that, as opposed to worshiping the kind of culture of youth and getting that circulated through social media, et cetera, et cetera. So how does it look from your angle? Where are the places of possibility and need?
Well, natural selection suggests that we would not have a capacity for altered states of consciousness unless the ability to alter our consciousness conferred some advantage for survival, right? And we see this innate, deep desire of people from all generations, particularly younger people, to shift their consciousness through substances, through experiences, by going to festivals, parties and events, and having those experiences there. So my most recent art piece that I've put together tries to bridge that deep desire from younger generation to alter their consciousness and connect them to the wisdom of older people who have a lot of experience in those realms. It's a piece of art called The Grandparent Room, and it's a space inside of festivals and events in which we recruit elders, people in their 60s and 70s, 80s, to play the role of grandparents and be at a festival or event and be present to interact and listen to and support mostly younger people who come and talk with them and ground with them and ask them for advice and reflection and feedback. What I'm trying to replicate in this piece of art is the complete unconditional love and understanding that you receive from your grandparents, if you're so lucky to have gotten that in your life. Our relationship with our parents is really different, but our grandparents are really in our corner, always, ideally, if you're so lucky to have had that experience. And so I want to create that experience for people where if they feel untethered or they need some grounding or advice or just pure love, they can go and check in with Granny or Grandpa And this art piece so far has been really successful. I'm recruiting elders to work on this piece with me. And we've gotten a really great response from people who come to talk to the elders and connect and really enrich their lives through this experience.
Oh yeah, that sounds pretty wonderful. Where are you going to be doing that?
Well, I've created this art piece at Take Three events. We've created it at our tea house events as well. The tea house, the Full Circle Tea House, also has its own events, and we've created this art piece there, and people can come and talk to the elders when the Full Circle Tea House is set up at festivals or private parties or other events where we serve. And it's a piece of portable art that I'd like to bring to other gatherings. It's a piece of art in evolution. It's exciting. I'm having fun with it. And I get to meet a lot of great elders in the process.
Yeah, no, it sounds great. Well, we only have a couple of minutes left here, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to let people know where they could find out more about the upcoming event in New York.
You can go to visionarycongress.org for information about the Women's Visionary Congress events next weekend in New York City. We'll be having a salon with 3 speakers, Catherine McLean, Julie Holland, and Allison Gray, 3 of our favorite female visionaries from the New York area. And we'll also be partnering with the Symposia group on Saturday night for a visionary storytelling event. And on Friday night during that weekend, we'll be having a party at the Rubin Museum in Manhattan. So go to the visionarycongress.org website and you can read more about it, or the Reality Sandwich story about the weekend.
Great, Annie. Well, I've got to wrap it up there. Thanks so much for joining us in Expanding Mind.
Hey, thank you, Eric. I've really enjoyed talking with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it was great to hear your story. Annie's one of those amazing figures who kind of works in the background a little bit, and I'm really happy to bring you out and have your the whole rich tale brought forth. It's really a wonderful story. So from me to all you out there, until next week, keep your minds open.